Thank you, Chairman Schmidt, Ranking Member Welch, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. Political speech and violence should never go hand in hand. I'm here today because I've seen this play out firsthand over the last several years and certainly during my time in government service. Let me be clear, I support those who lawfully exercise their constitutional rights, but when speech turns to violence, we must hold those committing violence accountable. The increase in politically motivated violence over the last several years has been driven largely by radical left-wing extremist groups and individuals that believe violence is a legitimate means to achieve political goals. A recent analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies shows that, quote, left-wing violence has risen in the last 10 years, and left-wing incidents in 2025 are on track to reach 30-year highs. A recent Rutgers University poll found that 55%, over half of the respondents of left of center said it would be somewhat justified to murder President Trump, and 48% said the same about Elon Musk. According to another recent poll, 1 in 4 people on the far left believe that violence can be justified. That is 1 in 4. The data paints a disturbing picture that some on the left, especially younger adults, are increasingly supportive of violence as a form of protest. In 2020, as Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, I witnessed 100 consecutive nights of violence in Portland, Oregon. Every night, hundreds of violent anarchists surrounded the Hatfield Federal Courthouse. They hurled commercial-grade fireworks, sledgehammers, concretes, and even IEDs at our federal officers. They set fire, they vandalized property, and assaulted law enforcement. Their goal was not peaceful protest. It was destruction, coercion, and intimidation. At the time, I pleaded with local officials, including the governor and the mayor there in Portland, to help protect our officers, and time again, they refused to act. They chose politics over public safety. The result was more than 280 injuries to law enforcement officers and millions of dollars of damage to federal property and to local businesses. Back then, we saw public figures attacking federal law enforcement officers, calling them stormtroopers, Gestapo, and thugs. Comparing American law enforcement to Nazi Germany was irresponsible, reckless, and dangerous then, as it remains so today. Unfortunately, this disgusting rhetoric and behavior has only intensified. Once again, we're seeing violent attacks against law enforcement officers, and again, public figures are describing them as Nazis. The difference between 2020 and now, however, is that the Trump administration knows what to expect and is fighting aggressively to hold these violent offenders accountable. The administration has rightfully designated Antifa as domestic terrorists, has begun a whole-of-government investigation into the financing and resourcing of this group, and has charged Antifa members with providing material support for terrorism. And despite what the mainstream media insists, groups like Antifa are not disorganized. They are increasingly organized, funded, and networked. They plan online, they operate anonymously, and execute in ways that make detection difficult. Make no mistake, their lack of structure is not a feature. It is a feature, not a bug. And it is designed to evade accountability and prosecution. Critics argue because they have no formal leadership, they shouldn't be treated as domestic terrorists. I believe this completely misses the point. This decentralized model mirrors what we have seen from jihadist networks, cyber criminals, and other criminal groups. Their lack of a hierarchy makes them more dangerous. This past summer, the American people witnessed multiple anti-fascist inspired attacks and threats on law enforcement, journalists, and civilians. This includes threats against ICE officers, other government officials, and even Attorney General Bondi just yesterday. Tragically, this also includes the sickening assassination of Charlie Kirk. I want to state this as plainly as I can. Enforcing immigration laws passed by Congress almost 60 years ago, is in no way, shape, or form fascism. Every sovereign nation has a right to choose who is allowed to legally enter the country. Throwing around words like fascist and Nazi not only cheapens history, but it fuels increasing hostility towards law enforcement, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The rise in political violence presents a grave threat to our constitutional order and rule of law. The federal government has a duty and a responsibility to respond. We must continue to give law enforcement the tools and the resources they need, allow ICE to operate safely in courthouses and jails across the country, increase penalties for those that dox federal officers, and expand joint task forces to dismantle. We owe it to the families who have lost loved ones, including Erica Kirk and others who continue to grieve, to ensure that their calls for accountability are answered and that our nation restores the respect for law and order. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Chairman Schmidt, Ranking Member Welch, distinguished senators. Thank you for your leadership on this critical issue and for the opportunity to testify today. 26 years ago, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I've spent my career honoring that oath as an Army officer, a terrorism researcher, and leading prevention programs at the Department of Homeland Security. It's a lifelong commitment to protect kids and schools, families and faith communities, public spaces and workplaces, and the democratic institutions and freedoms our founders gave us. This isn't about politics or party for me. It never has been. I'm here representing a community of like-minded practitioners, law enforcement, mental health, educators, veterans, who work every day to prevent violence before it destroys families and communities. We're united by a simple belief: targeted violence is preventable, and American communities deserve better than waiting for the next attack. We should all condemn targeted violence. It's tragic, unethical, and illegal. I want to start by acknowledging the threats, the loss, and the fear that too many Americans and too many elected officials have experienced. But we should also not mistake the blame game for advancing solutions. Solutions must be based on data and evidence. Solutions must focus on preventing political violence in the first place, instead of reacting after the damage has been done. And solutions must reinforce our constitutionally protected freedoms, not erode them. To inform policymaking, Congress legislated that the executive branch provide data on terrorism and targeted violence. DHS contracted with START at the University of Maryland to produce the T2V data set, although the administration abruptly canceled funding in March. START data demonstrate clearly that violent events do not fit neatly into any one ideological category, and that there has been an alarming increase in attacks and credible plots in the United States, including over a 2,000% increase in mass casualty plots since the early 1990s. We average more than 2.5 attacks and credible plots per day in the US, and over 50% of them succeed. They occurred in over 1,200 US towns and cities. This year, compared to last year, terrorism events are up 67% and fatalities are up nearly 150%. Americans are dying from ISIS-inspired, white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-government, anti-vax, anti-law enforcement, and nihilistic attacks. So these data highlight 3 challenges that we need to solve for. The volume problem. With 2.6 events per day, we are at risk of accepting targeted violence as inevitable. It is not. It is preventable. The structural gap problem. These plots succeed 55% of the time. The structural gap is due to appropriate limitations placed on criminal justice investigations to protect privacy, civil liberties, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. So we can't fill the structural gap with criminal justice-only solutions and maintain the freedoms enshrined in our Constitution. And third, the reality is that targeted violence manifests in many different forms of terrorism, hate crime, and school shootings. Any approach that only addresses one manifestation will be both operationally ineffective and fiscally inefficient. At DHS, I led prevention programs that partnered federal resources with local teams, sheriffs who knew their counties, schools who knew their students, mental health professionals who knew their patients, pastors who knew their congregations. Local Americans protecting local communities. This allowed us to engage in early interventions that addressed all of the challenges I mentioned. Volume, we supported nearly 1,200 interventions for people on the pathway to violence, 0 committed violence while in the program. We filled the structural gap and bridged to public safety. In 94% of the cases, the individuals received support from mental health professionals, social workers, or other helping professionals. 6% were referred to law enforcement. Most of the individuals, 70%, were not yet self-medicating on any one specific ideology when they came to us, just angry, isolated, and struggling. And yet, without indexing our programs on any one ideology, the intervention succeeded across all ideologies, making this approach both effective and cost-effective. Nearly 1,200 people at risk of hurting themselves and others. But before families had to bury loved ones, we invested in prevention instead. Political violence threatens our constitutional order, but not just the violence, also how we respond to it. Whether we choose to do what works, quietly investing in scaling up prevention efforts, or we feed political polarization that makes Americans less safe and erodes our Constitution. Americans deserve, and the Constitution demands, the former. Thank you.
Chairman Schmidt, Ranking Member Welch, and all the members of this committee. The ranking member suggested that we condemn political violence, which surely we must all do. But then he suggested that we not try to pinpoint exactly which side the violence comes from. This seems to me confusing and misbegotten, as one cannot solve a problem if one does not know where the problem lies. In light of the murder of my friend Charlie Kirk by a leftist assassin, I am gratified to see that at least some members of our federal legislature are now confronting the consistent and escalating pattern of left-wing terrorism in the country. Lest I be accused of partisan invective, on September 23rd, no less an emblem of American liberalism than The Atlantic magazine published an article citing a recent study from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, admitting that the left is more violent today than the right. Less honest liberals, including members of Congress, continue to deny this fact. Democrat Congressman Seth Moulton, for example, reacted to Charlie's assassination by blaming the right. Congressman Moulton claimed that 3/4 of political violence in the United States comes from the right, while only 4% comes from the left. That claim struck me, as it probably does many of you, as suspect. So I looked into just a few recent examples that came to mind of prominent left-on-right violence. The Covenant School Massacre in Nashville, in which a trans-identifying shooter murdered Christian school children after outlining her ideological motivations. According to authorities, there was no ideological motive there. Go figure. The Black Lives Matter riots, overtly leftist demonstrations that left dozens of people dead and over $1 billion worth of property damage. Likewise, those fail to show up on registers of left-wing political violence. Even an attack by Antifa that targeted me personally, as well as conservative college students for our political views, appeared in official records and data sets as nothing more than obstructing law enforcement. It turns out the left commits relatively little political violence when you don't count the political violence that the left commits. I am here today to speak about that single illustrative incident. On April 18th, 2023, I was invited to participate in a debate at the University of Pittsburgh on the topic of transgenderism. Before the debate, several hundred left-wing protesters gathered outside the student center, many dressed uniformly in black with face coverings. They lit the street on fire while burning me in effigy with a little Hitler mustache painted on my face. All because I hold the view, as most Americans do, that men cannot become women. Buildings in the area were placed on a soft lockdown. As the Pittsburgh Bureau of Fire put out my burning effigy, an Antifa operative named Brian DePippa, hiding behind his wife, Crystal, rolled 2 smoke bombs under police barricades. Attendees scattered while demonstrators chanted, "Fascists go home." DePippa then threw a lit firework into a group of police officers protecting the building. The explosion injured several officers, including severe and life-altering injuries to a female officer. The debate was forced to end early after campus police determined that the protests outside were becoming even more destructive. The campus issued a safety emergency notification. Despite popular efforts to deny the existence of organized left-wing terrorism, Brian and Crystal DePippa were not merely 2 citizens protesting a speaker with whom they disagreed. Things just got a little out of hand. No. They are members of an extremist cell, a cell that meets at an anarchist bookshop, the sort of venue that operates as training grounds for left-wing terror attacks. Brian DePippa repeatedly set off TSA screeners for explosive material on his body. The Torch Antifa network has claimed the DePippas as members and raised money for them through a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. Imagine. Thanks to a courageous FBI agent who happened to be on the scene, the Department of Justice was impelled to bring charges. Unfortunately, our justice system gave them only a slap on the wrist. I think we should all be able to agree that throwing an explosive at a group of people is no mere minor indiscretion. That is a very serious crime. That's attempted murder. the kind of crime that merits life in prison. Instead, our justice system sentenced Brian DePippa to minimal jail time for obstructing law enforcement. His wife got off with probation. The federal government must act now to stop the consistent and accelerating trend of leftist terrorism. For a legislator to deny the threat and neglect the remedy might once have been chalked up to ignorance. Today, it is nothing less than complicity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. However, I draw upon my experiences as one of the few police officers in this country who has policed both the protests and riots of 2020, as well as the insurrection of January 6, 2021. I am intimately familiar with political violence, as when I fought to defend the United States Capitol and many of your very lives, I was beaten, bloodied, crushed, with my eye gouged, and my skull smashed with my own baton. Political violence is a worthy topic for discussion. However, the press release I saw from the subcommittee chair made it clear that this was not going to be an honest consideration of various causes and effects, but rather a ham-fisted attempt to propagate the unsupported notion that liberal ideology is the greatest origin of modern political violence. This is particularly galling to me since every single member of the majority on the subcommittee has either contributed to one of the most infamous examples of conservative political violence of our age or the protection of its perpetrators. Every majority member who could do so voted to acquit Donald Trump during his second impeachment, and now we find ourselves in a new horrific age of political violence, one where it is carried out by the state itself. A permanent resident was arrested without a warrant and is being threatened with deportation simply for his politics. A Tennessee man was arrested and is being held on $2 million bail for sharing a Trump meme on social media. Members of Congress have been denied access to ICE facilities despite the law granting them unannounced oversight rights. These detentions and prohibitions are all grounded in the threat of deadly force and violence, are absurd or outright illegal, and politically motivated by right-wing ideology. The fact that these actions are carried out by agents of the state doesn't make them acceptable, it makes them far worse. The current administration is doing whatever it can to downplay the threat that right-wing violence presents to the United States, including literally erasing data. Between September 12th and the 13th of this year, the Department of Justice deleted their own study from their website, which came to the conclusion that right-wing extremism poses a much greater threat than left-wing extremism. I quote now the opening paragraph of this National Institute of Justice report published just last year. Quote, militant, nationalistic, white supremacist, violent extremism has increased in the United States. In fact, the number of far-right attacks continues to outpace all other types of terrorism and domestic violence extremism. Since 1990, far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left or radical Islamist extremists, including 227 events that took more than 520 lives. In this same period, far-left extremists committed 42 ideologically motivated attacks that took 78 lives. A recent threat assessment by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security concluded that domestic violent extremists are an acute threat and highlighted a probability that COVID-19 pandemic-related stressors, long-standing ideological grievances related to immigration, and narratives surrounding electoral fraud will continue to serve as a justification for violent actions. There will always be those who seek to further their own political agenda through extra-legal violence, and that is what law enforcement is for. But to reduce the risk of the population at large from falling into radicalization, the solution is simple. It's unfettered democracy. One of democracy's greatest assets is how, when unsullied, it provides a mechanism for everyone to have their voice heard. And when people believe their government speaks for them in some manner, then they're less apt to seek violent means to accomplish their political agendas. So make voting easier, not harder. Stop gerrymandering people into oblivion. Stand on the strength of your ideals, not the depth of your donors' pockets. Stop shopping for judges and start seeking ideas that withstand scrutiny from any political ideology. When you tell the people that an election was stolen from them, they will take up arms against their neighbors without a shred of evidence, I know. But if you tell them brilliant political rhetoric is their birthright and civic engagement is their privilege, they'll instead take up the book and the pen, and we'll all be richer for it. And when you, just so you know that this is the helmet that U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick wore on January 6, 2021, and he died the following day. The family member just got back that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Welch, distinguished senators. I would like to thank you for the invitation to testify today about the threat our country faces from growing political violence. In my capacity at the Center for Security Policy, one of the things I am most proud of is our program to provide educational briefings to law enforcement officers at the federal, state, and local levels. And for the 5 years of this program's operation, the #1 most requested briefing topic that we have been asked to provide has been on the topic of Antifa and related left-wing extremist groups. The reason it has been the most requested topic is not because, contrary to media reports, Antifa does not exist. America's law enforcement knows it exists because they see the effects every day. The reason it is the most requested topic is because they cannot get accurate and quality information about the threat. Until recently, the federal government has failed to define the extensive nature of this threat and has demonstrated a history of dismissing or reducing charges against left-wing extremists. But despite this failing, we have seen convictions for acts of political violence by Antifa members who were identified as such. In 2021, officers and citizens were injured in a violent, pre-planned riot carried out by Antifa. The San Diego District Attorney successfully secured convictions against 11 Antifa members, including on charges of conspiracy to riot. In 2023, the state of Florida successfully sued Antifa members under the FACE Act, securing civil fines and felony pleas for their attack on pregnancy crisis centers. This is just one case, but in the 5 months after the Dobbs decision was leaked, more than 100 churches, pregnancy resource centers, and pro-life organizations across the country were attacked. Mr. Knowles has already mentioned the case against Brian DePippa and the federal government's guilty plea, but I think it is worth adding that Mr. DePippa was also the web creator for It's Going Down, an Antifa website which has for years published both ideological manifestos and tactical instructions for aspiring Antifa members, including a 2007 Forming an Antifa Group manual, which I first brought to the attention of this committee when I testified before it in August of 2020. But what is Antifa? Well, as a recent Department of Justice indictment accurately describes, quote, Antifa is a militant enterprise made up of networks of individuals and small groups ascribing to a revolutionary anarchist or autonomous Marxist ideology, which explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government, law enforcement authorities, and system of law. Antifa adherents have espoused insurrection and advocated violence to affect the policy and conduct of the U.S. government by intimidation and coercion. That's a good working definition, which would bring U.S. law enforcement into line with the definitions which are utilized by other Western governments, which also have an Antifa threat. That would include Germany and Sweden. These networks of small direct action groups are connected through ideologically aligned organizations, online platforms, and support networks, which provide significant amounts of material support. But much of this material support is in the form of services rather than financial transactions. One example, the website Abolition Media posts communiques from the PFLP, the ELN, the PKK, and the MPA, all of them designated communist terror groups. That alone is actionable material support for terrorism. But it also posts claims of responsibility for anarchist arson attacks and propaganda on behalf of Antifa members currently in prison for violent attacks in the United States, Germany, Chile, Greece, and Hungary. The site distributes calls for actions and organizes efforts for Antifa groups across international borders, and even posted an anarchist manual discussing the value of, and I quote, complex coordinated terrorist attacks. If this site were promoting and advocating violence for al-Qaeda, there would be absolutely no question in the minds of U.S. authorities that it serves as a media arm for a terrorist organization. According to a recent article by journalist Hudson Crozier, Abolition Media is just one of 100 such websites hosted on No Blogs, a blogging suite provided by the Italy-based Autistici Inventi Collective, which provides websites, emails, digital encryption tools to Antifa and related left-wing extremist groups, all while hiding their personal data from law enforcement. Very similarly, the International Antifa Defense Fund has distributed over $250,000 to 800 Antifa members across 26 countries, including not just for legal support, but up to 20% has gone to security improvements and emergency relocation costs for Antifa members. It would be a reasonable avenue of investigation to determine if funds have gone to help fugitive Antifa members avoid arrest. I look forward to working with the committee on ways U.S. policy and legislation might address the threat posed by Antifa and related left-wing extremist groups.